Hey everybody, and welcome to the third event in this year's Red May 2021, our fifth year. Can you believe it? It's amazing. We've got a large number of events coming up. I think we have 40 more events for the month. And welcome to the third event in this year's Red May 2021. I seem to be echoing to myself as we say it. Well, let me clue you in quickly about our schedule for the rest of the week. We have on Thursday, tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific time, Real Abstraction in the Mind, but not from there, with Gian Moreno, Jale Mansour, Johanna Goss, and Sven Ludiken. That's based on a book in Verso about real abstraction in art. And then at 4 p.m., we have Red Nation Rising, from border town violence to native liberation. David Correa, Jennifer Nez-Denetdale, Chris Latre is the moderator. On Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, Survival and Resistance, Mutual Aid in Disastrous Time, the kind of seminar around Dean Spade's book on mutual aid, with Adrienne Marie Brown, Chandan Reddy, Dean Spade, Clee Bentley, and Naomi Klein. And at 3 p.m., what we talk about when we talk about Marx, that's Friday, May 7th, is a conversation between Jason Smith and Paul Maddock Jr. You will know them from the Brooklyn Rail, the Field Notes page, which is one of the best places to go for a sense of the current moment. We are not funded by any institution. So Ranjan, tell us where we can send the money if we want to support Red May. If out of the kindness of strangers, they reach into their pockets and take out those credit cards.
We have information just below the YouTube, in the YouTube description. We've got a link to the Patreon, and on our website, there's a link to donate as well. So you can just
Great. Okay, so the website, www.redmayseattle.org. You can either you can donate on a Patreon there, or go to Fan the Flames of Red May, which is our GoFundMe. But now let's get on to the current panel. I'm very happy to welcome, all the way from Berlin, I believe, Bini Adamczak, who is the author of the inimitable Communism for Kids, which I'm sure some people are lucky enough to have bought and read. Bini is a philosopher and artist who writes on political theory, queer politics, and the past future of revolutions, particularly in this new book, Yesterday's Tomorrow, on the loneliness of communist specters and the reconstruction of the future. We're happy to have Seattle's own Michael Hardt as a co-discussant. Michael, of course, is the author with Tony Negri of Empire, Multitude, Commonwealth, Assembly, and of course, many other books. So let's get to it. I think in the beginning, Bini, you want to read a section of the book to start off? Have at it.
Exactly. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, everybody, for the invitation. I'm very excited about this panel and the chance to discuss the book, Yesterday's Tomorrow, on the loneliness of communist specters and the reconstruction of the future, book that I wrote in 2007, at least that's the date when it was published in Germany. But since the topic is the communist revolution and especially the history of the Soviet Union, I think it's not outdated at all. And the opposite might be true. All the questions raised regarding the relationship of our present or future and the past are still very valid and important, I think, for the discussion today. I will be reading a collage of the first 3 chapters of the book. The book consists of 6 chapters, so it's a short book, an essay, you might say. And I will be reading 30 minutes to start and give you also an impression what the method of this book is. So I'm gonna jump right into it. Yesterday's morning. The last warm rays of the sun expire. Not a single bird takes off from the leafless trees. Not a single wing beat can be heard. As if they have forgotten the point of flying, have lost the faith in being borne up by the air, the creatures perch on the slender branches. Slowly, the long shadows of the telegraph poles, once meant to connect the continent to come, retreat in the harvested fields. The odd forgotten plate of brass waits motionless in the windless early dusk. In the distance, scattered woodlands mingle with border villages history forgot. It's getting dark. Just maybe, though, there is a bit of light left. A fleeting night offers a glimpse of landscapes animated by unchanged fieldwork. Here and there, the dew clings to the waves of grain. The first cars take to the road, and for a few kilometers, they pass alongside the railway. Something warm seeps through the tiny cracks in the vehicle. At times, the fog still clouds the view, which even without it would not be clear. After the day-long journey from Moscow or further away onto the Russian border, their eyes can grow weary watching the fields which rush past and yet, in their immensity, seem stationary. But the eyes of the German anti-fascists, the communist emigrants, see nothing. There are no windows in their barred compartments. Perhaps outside, the first patches of light are grazing the ground while the mountains of the horizon stretch their stony heads upward into the dawning day. Or maybe it's already daytime. Possibly, even probably, it is pride out, because the weather bends seldom to the history writer's metaphoric wishes. A radiant day, white from the snow on the summits in the distance, from the glittering of the wide rivers, the Polish lakes. The almost noonday sun stands in the otherwise empty sky, warms the row of the Stolipinski carriages, rolling prisons where the inmates sit 7 to a car. The rattling of the train makes conversation between one compartment and the other impossible. For a time, songs are audible and encouraging words, but then, all at once, they fall silent. The wardens bring water and generous helpings of food, but now the prisoners have lost their appetite. Why now? Just eat. There's plenty of time for you to go hungry later, one of the soldiers tells them kindly. The soldiers are from the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the Russian Soviet secret police, and they have been ordered to bring a sealed cargo across the border, silent human cargo. When the train slows down, the sun perhaps reaches its zenith, nature shows itself blind to history. In the train station, the anti-fascist prisoners step out, walk on foot for the final wooded sketch. On the train bridge from Brest-Litovsk, the nearly established border, the road comes to an end. Other soldiers come from the other side of the bridge, raise their hands to their caps to greet the officers of the NKVD. The names are read out, the exchange begins. Those who resist in panic are shoved. The Jews amongst them are received with anti-Semitic tirades by the German soldiers, the soldiers of the SS. A train of many trains, of forgotten trains. Special trains in which the NKVD transports German or Austrian communists to the German border, deliver them to the Gestapo. Of the 1,000 deportees, more than 300 communists, Jews, and anti-fascists. A multitude of transports, the first already in 1935, the last in May 1941, a month before the outbreak of the war. They arrived in the Soviet Union as supporters of the revolution, and most remained until 1933 or 1934. Some of them left only later, after years of fighting in the underground, building and rebuilding the Communist Party, the KPD, Communist Party of Germany, without cease until their cover was blown and they had to escape. Many of them have been in German prisons, have suffered torture, some in the first concentration camps. They are anti-fascists. They even have the state seal of approval, and the Soviet authorities are strict in these matters. Only those who engaged in active resistance according to the standards of the KPD are allowed to immigrate. Anti-Semitic persecution isn't enough to qualify for an offer of asylum. Persecuted by the Nazis, fleeing the threat of the camps, these communists flee into Russian exile, into the Soviet Republic, the fatherland of the workers of the proletariat, to Moscow, the reddest city on the planet. Protection is not what they hoped for most, but the chance to go on contributing to the construction of socialism, to organize resistance to Germany in exile. Very few of them mean to stay. They want to go back with new papers, with a different mission. And back they go, but unarmed, not as revolutionaries, as Soviet soldiers, but rather as their captives. Not all the deported anti-fascists are freed after their interrogation to labor for the German cause or to fight as soldiers in the German Wehrmacht. The Gestapo's orders exclude those who, quote, were active Marxist militants prior to emigration, who engaged in anti-German political activities, or who continued to cling to their communist conviction, as well as those of Jewish lineage. For these people, return means to prison and ghettos, to concentration and extermination camps. Only a few survive, the rest will die there. In Lublin, Neuengamme and Mauthausen, in Auschwitz and Majdanek. Like spokes in a wheel, which seem to stand still, then turn backward. Once it reaches a certain speed, these trains travel back from socialist Russia into National Socialist Germany, in the opposite direction of the sealed train that, decades before, had brought Lenin to Petrograd to wage revolution. Unceasing progress, which was meant to push history toward communism, with an inevitable leap from the first revolution in 1917 to the second, then to the worldwide one, ends here. Not halfway, how nice that might have been, not at the beginning, but even earlier, in the camps. Almost naturally those of the enemy, but also incomprehensibly those of one's allies. Double betrayal. Betrayal of anti-fascism, betrayal of communism. You rarely get the first without the second, and you never have the second without the first. But above all, betrayal of the communists, of one comrade by the other. Betrayed to those who they have fought against for the better part of their lives from 1918 on. Betrayed by those for whom they have sacrificed their lifetime, for whom they were willing to sacrifice their lives. Without a name they die, without a struggle, most of them not at the barricades, but behind them, in Moscow prisons, deep in the Siberian steppes, back at the German camps. But how are we to remember them? How do we remember those of whom there is so little left to remember? And above all, with whom do we remember them? Whom do we raise the alarm to? Whom do we warn or turn to for help? Who do we call to in the name of a justice deferred, past due, of zealous partisanship for those the party betrayed? With whom do we mourn the lost, the murdered, the abandoned revolutionaries? Abandoned in the train cars, hiding out in another country, betrayed in the concentration camps, subdued in tiny apartments in Moscow, in jail cells in Siberian work camps. They have no allies left, no friends across the border, no fellow fighters, no comrades back home, no one who takes heart at the thought of them, no one they might think of to fire their hopes. Who to share their loneliness with? At least that. At least to offer them companionship, imaginary, belated companionship. Perhaps like Vaso Milic, a character from a novel by Manesh Berber, they carry out conversations with themselves as they await arrest. Conversations in truth addressed to friends across the border, the long deceased comrades who are the only ones capable of measuring the distance that separates the fall of 1939 from October 1970. To them, and to them alone, to those they shared the experience of revolution with, the memory of that historically unique, world-spanning hope, could they convey the hopeless disappointment that has beset them. For a brief moment, they were granted, or at least caught a glimpse of, another life, the end of their history and the history of their ancestors, and then it was taken away. Perhaps nothing will ever compensate for this loss, certainly not in their brief lives or in any moment that has come after, all the way down to this very day. Rather, the loss itself will become lost. For their successors, this loss will be the precondition of their political existence, the basis of their political experience. Even with great effort, they will remain incapable of understanding this revolutionary disappointment, though we, all the way down to this very day, are the children in the strict historical scientific sense of this disappointment. It's not us who experienced this disappointment, but quite the opposite. We were made out of it. In 1937, that long year that begins with the first Moscow show trial in August of 1936 and lasts until the last show trial in March of 1938, the October Revolution celebrates its 20th, its last anniversary. In 1937, amid the roar of the Great Terror, the Russian Revolution founders drowns in a plan-like rush chokes on itself. Independently of where it came from, independent of when exactly it began, the counter-revolution now attains its final triumph. Because it is, without a single doubt, the counter-revolution that reaches its conclusion in that year, 1937. It is such because it brings the revolution to an end, buries, first of all, above all, the revolutionaries themselves. Of the 1,900 delegates of the 17th Party Congress in 1934, 1,100 of them are imprisoned, disappeared, shot, buried after not even 5 years. Of the 139 party secretaries listed in the 1936 Directory of Moscow, only 7 remain in office. In 1937, the Red Army loses more officers than any army before in peacetime. The exiled Japanese Communist Party is decimated. The Polish Party is thoroughly liquidated. In Leningrad, the capital of the revolution, as in the rest of Russia, 90% of all party cadres are locked up. The bugs, nests of the Trotskyite fascists are smoked out and destroyed. The counter-revolution is exhaustive. From Voronezh, the party functionary Andrei Andreev telegraphs Moscow. Here, the Politburo no longer exists. All cadres have been imprisoned as enemies, now back to Rostov. Without a doubt, it is the Stalinist counter-revolution that liquidates the revolution. And at the same time, it surely is not. At no point does this counter-revolution declare itself to be a counter-revolution. At no point does it declare war on the achievements of the revolution. Indeed, what it declares war on is the counter-revolution. Not from without does it strike the socialist homeland, but from within, from the headquarters of the regime, from the center of the party. It organizes no military putsch, summons no allied troops from other countries, but rather unmasks on its own constantly, tirelessly, the omnipresent conspirators, spies, agents of enemy powers. It marches not under the white banner, but under the red. And it fights not in the name of order, of freedom, of the market, but in the name of the revolution, of socialism, of plans. For it was planned, the great wave of terror, centrally, bureaucratically. A state socialist terror plan, just as precise and just as imprecise as state socialist economic planning. On July 30, 1937, order number 447 is issued. It demands the arrest of 332,000 people, divided into two categories. 259,000 who are to be imprisoned for 8 to 10 years, and 73,000 who are to be executed. Repression, like production, should be carried out according to quotas. And the quotas, as always in the realm of the brave Stakhanov workers, will be exceeded. In this socialist competition, the cadres outdo each other to prove their diligence, just as a certain Khrushchev, later renowned as an anti-Stalinist, who orders the execution of 55,000 suspects in response to a quota of 50,000. Soon, after just 1 month, the regional cadres demand an increase in their respective quotas. Soon, other orders succeed order number 447. After the liquidation of the former kulaks, criminals, and other anti-Soviet elements, comes the liquidation of criminal elements, and then the liquidation of families of enemies of the people. When the wave of terror runs down, 1,345,000 people have been sentenced, 682,000 of them to death. These judgments, representing 85% of all death sentences handed down during the Stalinist era, are carried out during the festivities marking the 20th anniversary of the revolution, accompanied by parades and merrymaking, framed by radiant banners. Life has become better, life has become more cheerful. The future promised by communism never became present, nor did it remain future. This is the meaning of all talk of the end of history. It is the realization of the Popperian motto, which seems to have set the mood for the world after 1990, at least for 2 decades. The world has been vindicated, may not be the best of all worlds, but is the best of all worlds that exist. It is sympathetically say compared to the mindless white lies of Stalinism. But right from the first, this slogan, which presents itself in the rhetoric of compromise as dispassionate cool-headedness, is beset with a dreadful sorrow. They have not stopped to linger because things are so nice, but rather because they lack the courage to go on. Movement is pointless. This is what makes the jubilant cries of the Cold War victors so unconvincing. They lack all joy. Instead of relief at averting looming danger or shared joy at the newfound fortune of the former oppressed Russia's newly minted billionaires, it expresses something resembling embittered malevolence. The Schadenfreude those who stayed home feel for their siblings drowned at sea. Victory is thus tarnished by foregoing defeat. Anti-communists didn't win, they capitulated to fate. The anti-communists do not win, they give up. They give up their dreams. Apologetics for the status quo are so based not on the celebration of the reality, but on the restriction of mourning for the possible. Not on fear for what has been achieved, but on fear of what is achievable. Both, however, have their basis in history, and this is the rationale for this book. Whoever doesn't want to talk about Stalinism had better keep quiet about communism. But what can be said about Stalinism by those who refuse to hear about communism? Those who wish to write the history of this past without writing about the history of that future that was buried in it. Just like value theory, relative value theory, the comparative analysis of domination always avoids the very thing it oscillates around eternally, domination itself. And domination itself can only be understood in light of its possible abolition. The possibility of freedom from domination does exist, but not a priori, only historically. This is the advent of communism. What the communists promised was the abrogation of all dominance. And as long as they are remembered, they will never cease to have promised that. It is common for dominance to dress up as freedom. Since the bourgeois revolution at the latest, these are almost the only garments it has donned. But something has changed ever since the domination of those who fought against all domination in the world has entered the world. And all those who count off all the roads paved with good intentions, or pronounce in resignation that power has won out over all ideas, ignore this something. Man is born bad, is the many-faced formula this work of mourning concludes in. A historical melancholy disguised as realism on the social level. Man is the enemy of man. He has always slaughtered his own and will go on doing so in the future. War yesterday, war today, war tomorrow. That sounds dreadful, but the reality is far more dreadful than that. For the assertion of the repetition of the same is actually a consolation that covers over the true horror. If it was always bad, then really nothing bad has happened, nor can anything really bad happen. To have learned everything from the past, and therefore to be incapable of learning anything from the future, even when the only thing there was to learn was fear, is a pernicious consolation. A consolation that can no longer console, since the future has been promised, in which the lessons of the past are no longer valid, in which there is no more cause for fear. Stalinism, this crime against the future of mankind, is so not just any dominance, not just one more form of dominance, but instead the first and paradigmatic link in an unbroken chain of disappointments that could only be so devastating because they were based on a hope unknown to earlier generations. That is why the first reproach against anti-communism must be that of downplaying the crimes of Stalinism. Not because an idea was murdered alongside the people in the gulags, how cynical, but because communism alone brought forth into the world the historically actionable demand to accept no disenfranchisement, to tolerate no more degradation. Since that time, even the slightest injustice grows greater, and the greatest pain hurts exponentially more. Thank you.
Thanks, Bini. Michael, would you like to share some reflections with us before we get into the discussion?
Absolutely. And in fact, what I'd like to do, and thanks, Bini, for that reading. I want to try to pose three topics for discussion that they aren't directly questions or topics internal to the book. There are things that I think that are raised by the book that I think that Bini and others here might find interesting. Two historical themes and then one political one. And I'll try to lay them all out first, just so you get an idea where I'm going. With the first one, the first historical claim, really the question is this: what are the historical conditions that make this book possible? And maybe to start, I was reflecting while reading the book that about 20 years ago, I was giving a lecture. It was some relatively large audience, if I remember right. And I was, of course, talking about communism and revolution, blah, blah, blah. And I remember somebody stood up in the audience in the middle and tried to stop the thing and started yelling at me, but what about the crimes of communism? And he kept going on about it until they finally convinced him to leave the thing. And my first response was, well, that's not my history. I think Bini's telling me, no, Michael, that is your history, and try to live within it. And so I guess that's where I'm trying to pose this first question about, because I think that it's different, that this book would not have been possible. Well, I'm not saying that Bini couldn't have written it. You could be on some other universe than me, but that there's certain things about the last 20, 30 years that have changed. So yeah, let me put it this way, even just to give two markers in this. Yeah, in fact, here's just a preview of what I'm thinking is that this kind of reflection, I'm not saying this book in particular, but this kind of reflection marks the end of the Cold War, or that we've entered into the post-Cold War. So here's two events. In 1997, there was a publication of this book called The Black Book of Communism, which made a lot of what do you call it? Newspaper journalism, reports and everything. And it was written by anti-communists, reactionaries of various sorts. They each have articles about the crimes of communism. And the only reaction that seemed possible at the time was to then publish a book about the crimes of capitalism. Obvious, not very difficult to do. But I think at that time, it would have been impossible. At 1997 was still within the post-Cold War, still within a Cold War frame. It would have been impossible not to respond to that kind of anti-communism, showing the crimes of various done in the name of communism, except with that kind of reaction. Then I'm also wondering, it's a little bit closer to us. I was thinking of the 2009 conference in London organized by Slavoj Žižek and Alain Badiou. I think it went under the title, The Idea of Communism. This is right around the time that Bini's writing the book, I think, because the book comes out in German in 2 years after this. And I think that was a very different operation than what Bini's doing. And I mean, because there was a series, it's not just Alain Badiou's idea of communism, his way of some ways separating the idea of communism from its history, from its being put into practice previously, etc. That, in my experience of that conference, and then there were a series of other conferences organized in the same way in different cities, was a series of affirmations of communism in the context of the end of the Cold War. And I include myself in it, because I was at that 2009 conference. Yeah, in fact, with the first one here, let me actually read two passages one that Bini already read, but one that she didn't, I think. With that first one, at the time of the Black Book of Communism and this anti-communist, essentially way of post-Cold War burying for good what the Cold War was. So now I'm reading on pages 55 and 56, a little bit, I think, after where Bini arrived at, which is, she writes, the responsibility for clarifying the question of why the attempt at liberation turned into the most gruesome despotism falls not on the monarchist counter-revolutionaries, on the whites, not even on the capitalists, but on the communists. In other words, that operation that was then really the task of anti-communists really should be the task of communists. And then with the second one, with that London conference, I would say Bini did read the line where she writes, "Whoever doesn't want to talk about Stalinism has no right to talk about communism, or can't yet talk about communism," something like that. Seems to me that would be what another operation we've seen. So there you get my my question. I mean, in some ways, I would say Bini's encouraging us to let go of our reflexive anti-communism. You know what I mean? Like, so for instance, Philip was saying earlier that every time we get, I don't know, a virus restriction, people say, oh, that's, that's like Stalinism or communism. And so, and it inspires in us, especially us who lived a little bit through the Cold War, a kind of anti-communism, a fuck you, like, what do you say about? But I think that Bini wants to let that go. And that's what I find very interesting. So one thing I admire most about the book is this ability to lucidly recognize all of the crimes and tragedies and betrayals, and still maintain a communist desire and a future of communism. Like that's what I think was not possible at these previous moments. So in 1997, with the Black Book of Communism, it seemed to give anything to the credence of the crimes of communism would mean somehow to make impossible the dream, the continuing desire. And I sort of read that still in the various idea of communism lectures. So anyway, that's, you get my thing. I guess just one last thing about this periodization question or historical question. Like, what are the conditions of possibility? That's really my question. What are the conditions of possibility of this book? Just one other anecdote about this, Cold War thing. I've been teaching a course on Marxism every spring to undergraduate students for the last 27 or 28 years. And it's really changed a lot, the students who come to the class, because in 1993, 1994, when I started doing this, 18 and 20-year-olds came to the class thinking they knew what Marxism was because they knew what Soviet doctrine was, or at least what some US view of Soviet doctrine was. And so in order to read Marx, we had to go through all of this unlearning in order to approach the text. It's really fantastic now, for the last, 15 years, that 18, 20-year-olds don't have that overlay and are able to read Marx for what Marx actually says. So I think that's just another indication that perhaps that we need to reflect on, or I need to reflect on. Maybe I should just pose this as a personal thing. Bini's book makes me reflect on what the current conditions are that allow a different relationship to the different histories of communism that don't themselves threaten. This is what I'm reading in her, a communist future and a communist desire, all these things. Okay, I think you get what I'm getting at with that. I'll be more brief with the last two. The second is another historical one, which is that this book, it goes anti-chronologically, that you probably got already from Bini's reading, but the latest it goes is really in the 1940s. And so I'm wondering, what if we were to extend this reasoning up to the 1980s and 1990? I mean, what does the logic of Bini's narrative, what would it say about the collapse of the Soviet Union and its end? And I think this is a little bit what I think. I'm projecting a little bit my own ideas, but I'm sort of thinking, what if there were another chapter in her book that were to go to that part? It seems to me that the argument is really that it's not about external pressures. It's not about, the desire to go get blue jeans in Western Germany, or the desire, or the competition, military competition with Reagan and his Star Wars program set like that. It's rather a completely internal question. In fact, I would say, this is what I'm trying to link up with Bini's narrative, is that it might be interesting to pose it that the Soviet Union collapsed not for having too much communism, as the anti-communists would say, but for a lack of communism. And here's a minor way of saying that, a kind of argument that I've made other times, which is that the Soviet Union succeeded, and this is a super reductive argument, excuse me for it, it succeeded perhaps overly well in a disciplinary modernization. In a disciplinary modernization that coincided with a certain industrial mentality and worker productivity question, but they didn't, they couldn't actually break out of the disciplinary framework. And that while at the same time the Soviet Union created an incredible mass intellectuality, through education programs, through scientific developments, etc., there was a kind of gap between, let's say, the subjective desires and creativity and the disciplinary nature of the. So I would try to fit that into a collapse due to the lack of communism. Of course, that means, and this is something that Bini seems to set on doing, rewriting what is meant by communism. Of course, when I say lack of communism, I don't mean lack of state control of the economy and social order. I mean I mean something quite different, as she does too. Okay, one last thing, which is more of a political question. Yeah. And this, okay, and this might be cheating, because I got the book, I got this idea from Bini's other book in English, Communism for Kids. And it posed a question for me in this book. And the question was really about what is meant by communism. Because in Communism for Kids, Bini says several times, it's a kind of refrain that communism is not the solution to all problems. It's only the solution to the problems caused by capitalism. In fact, let me just read. It comes in the very beginning, then it gets repeated several times. She writes, communism, oh yeah, she gives this example of an illness and what treats a remedy for that specific illness. Communism is kind of like that. It doesn't heal all suffering, but rather only the suffering caused by capitalism. And then my question was, so I have a question about that, really, or maybe I might even have a disagreement about that. Maybe it's not usually like me, but that's what. But I'm wondering if it's different in the other book, because this is why for me, I'm much more comfortable thinking of myself as a communist rather than as a Marxist, because I think communism does have to treat a series of other hierarchies and is not just about anti-capitalism. And I don't mean this just, so I think communism also has to be anti-patriarchal. It also has to be anti-white supremacist. It has to be, and why is that? That's not just because I'd say, well, communism is all good things. It's against all bad things. No, I don't mean that. I would say starting from the, or, I mean, one, I could mean that too, whatever. But it's a little bit more useful for me to say that the capitalist order, as it is formed historically, is inextricably tied and mutually constituted with the patriarchal order. And it's inextricably tied with and mutually constitutive of the racial hierarchy. And so it makes, it's impossible to, or rather politically detrimental to, I would put it that way, conceive of a communist project and a communist desire that only thinks in terms of capitalist order and thinks that these other struggles might be allied but separate. You know, because one could say, okay, well, I'm a communist, therefore I'm anti-capitalist. Of course, I'm an ally of the feminists and I'm an ally of the anti-racist. No, I think that it has to be internal, and that's why communism. And so that is, of course, thinking communism in a way that Marx couldn't. That's fine. The way that Lenin couldn't. Totally fine with that. Maybe Kollontai could think that a little bit, but just a little bit. Anyway, all of our ancestors isn't the point. So I guess I want to. This seems to me a political question. That, yeah, it doesn't have to be a question for you, Bini. It could just be a point of discussion in which what the because obviously, okay, let me come back so it doesn't seem too external to our conversation. Even though all that Bini was reading, and a large portion of this book, is about the crimes and the betrayals and the tragedies, underlying it all has to be and is a future project, a living project now. And so that's what I'm thinking. What is, clarifying this project that is not tarnished or diminished by these past tragedies? It seems to me that one has to, or I feel the need to fill it out a little bit more. Okay, I hope I didn't go on too long. I hope Philip and Bini, you can see what, at least the kind of things I'm going towards. So could start with any of those or leave them alone.
Well, thanks, Michael. And I think those are very useful points to start discussion. The notion in the beginning, for example, that the attitude that that happened years ago, that wasn't me. The communism I'm thinking about has no relation to that. All of that is true in a certain way, but we have to be attentive to what that statement echoes, a very specific one in American history that you hear a lot. which goes like this. My ancestors came over here in 1903. They came from Eastern Europe. They have nothing to do with slavery or whatever caused the Civil War. It's not, I'm not associated with that. And as we've learned to essentially distrust that statement or throw it out as any kind of answer to anything, we have to essentially embrace, in a certain way, what happened there. And the reason we have to do it, to overcome what Bini calls the loss of that loss. And what she means, the loss of the loss, is that the people who experienced that loss were those communists who fought for 20 years, who died or lined up against walls, and nobody remembers them in history, and they got nothing. So she joins essentially that powerful piece of writing from 1940, Benjamin's thesis of history on history, which says at a certain point, it's only by the redemption of the dead, going back into the past, that we can even get to the future. We have to validate their hopes and recognize them, and not just put that away and go and create our own little pure communism somewhere, you know, which we don't even call communism, which we call post-capitalism or anti-capitalism, because we're a little antsy about being associated with Stalin or so forth. One has to embrace it head on, because I think at some other point, Bini says in the book, you know, the head of Stalin is welded to the forehead of Karl Marx, whether we like it or not. It's just there. And it's very easy, as Badiou said, and essential, by the way, to say to anyone what particular paragraphs, what line in Capital leads to the Gulag or the Purge. They never can cite it, because of course it doesn't. And that's true, but it's somehow beside the point. So there has to be a way of going through that past and coming out the other side in a way that I think Benjamin thought and Bini advocates here. This was not a book that I saw a need for in the beginning. My first reaction, as I said, was something like, oh God, the Moscow Trials, we're going back here at this moment. Why? Why do we need this? Kind of unconsciously embracing the idea of you know, focusing on capitalism itself, and then leaving the creation of the future up to the creativity of the people in the future who, having been endowed with free choice, which they don't have now, will create a society, whatever needs to be done, but at least there'll be something that will not be a reified society that will reproduce itself, but will be created by human beings in the future. And I leave it to them. But at the moment, let's look at what capitalism is doing. And of course, the book gradually dissolves that attitude as you go for it. And you realize in your historical fraternity with all these people who have died and shared that dream, is that you have to rescue their dream, find out what it was, and don't dismiss them from the narrative that you're developing now. There's a wonderful, I could read so many. I had originally planned to just read parts of this because there are so many wonderful passages in it, like this one. The future today cannot simply be located in the moments of the present that point beyond it. There is no latent communism, no new society slumbering within the old, but instead, this future must first be dislodged from the moments in the past in which they are anchored. Lines broken off, in the gaps between the compulsory historical contexts, exist vanishing points whose vectors point in other directions. So, I mean, this is quite within the Benjaminian tradition of the tiger's leap in the past, finding those sort of possible futures or vectors that were never developed. What I learned today, listening to Bini read was that the book was written in 2007. I didn't look at the beginning. I just assumed it was written after Communism for Kids came out this year. And it seemed to me totally timely and apt. But putting it at 2007 lends it even more resonance. The other day when we were doing new Marxist approaches to literature and art, a lot of people gave sort of short autobiographical biographies of the stages on their return to Marx, from being lost in the 80s in the midst of theory and maybe some mild ideology critique, to going to the point where suddenly they were starting to call themselves communist, and the roads on the way turned out to be the WTO 1999 demonstrations, which got everybody to the stage of what you might call anti-corporatism. But again, moving beyond corporate, whatever. Then the invasion of Iraq, which made people anti-imperialists again, but we're still not talking communism. There are a lot of, then finally, in 2008, there's the financial crisis, and a lot of people said, and I took a course with David Harvey, or I watched the videos, and they get into the political economy of capitalism, and suddenly they find themselves on the other side, taking Marx serious as an analyst and embracing the whole communist tradition. So the book comes out, Bini's book comes out before that happens. It comes out a year before the financial crisis. People haven't made the pilgrimage back. They're still clothing the resistance in euphemisms like post-capitalism or whatever they might call it, and people are less inclined to do it now. So as people have made that leap over that first moment of referring to themselves, of embracing this tradition, it becomes even more imperative to go back and go through this past and find the slivers of hope and possibly other directions that can be taken. I have more to say about some of Michael's other points, but I'll stop at this point just because we should have some discussion.
I'm not sure how we're doing it now, because we also agreed that we want the audience to be able to participate, but I would also love to say something.
I think what we'll do is we'll have a bit of a discussion among ourselves and then invite.
Okay, great. So, of course, like Communism for Kids was published in US only in 2017, right? I think, which was almost 10 years after economical crisis, and is after the Occupy Wall Street protests. And an effect of these protests was, of course, as you just mentioned, Philip, that the term like socialism became interesting again for a broader population, that you have these surveys that say in the US more people or younger people are in favor of socialism than ever in the history of the United States. Of course, this is caused by the economical crisis and then the protest. And this was, of course, the moment when a big publishing house like MIT gets also interested in books on socialism and communism for a broader public. But then, of course, the publication of this book was met by this outburst by conservatives and anti-communists in the US, and none of them ever read the book, Breitbart and so on, openly declaring we will not read the book, but still writing a review, and of course all mentioning the horror of Stalinism, the gulags, and so on, and propagating that I would propagate these horrible Stalinist crimes. And it was, of course, interesting for me to read all these comments, since I had already 10 years before that written the book Yesterday's Tomorrow and could honestly say that I worked through the horrors of Stalinism much more sincerely than any of these anti-communists had done. I'd love to talk to all of your 3 points, Michael, but let me start maybe with one. My book, like the Communism for Kids, I wrote this book for a conference that comrades of mine, organized in Frankfurt, 2003, was called Indeterminate Communisms. I think both of you were not there, but like many international theorists were there. This Slavoj Žižek that you mentioned before was there. For example, this was 6 years before the conference, the idea of communism in London, which later then also came to Berlin. Was organized by Melanie Schreiber, Sabine Flick, Daniel Leuk, and so on. And their idea was that now, this was 10 years, more than 10 years after the fall of the wall, we could come back to the term of communism, like reclaim this term, because it had been somehow liberated from this dust, from this authoritarian grasp, right? And that we could bring back the term communism in the discussion. And for them, it was important because it was an answer to the neoliberal fragmentation of the left. We had leftists working on anti-fascism, some working feminism, anti-racism, but each of them working in their little field and having really difficulties of coming together. Of course, there were some theorists bringing into discussion like ideas of how to do that, you know, the multitude as a term. But at the same time, nobody at this conference was really interested in talking about the history. In fact, they felt like we have finally been liberated from this history. Now we can talk about communism without talking about the history of communism. And I wrote the Communism for Kids, but already in the epilogue, I reflected upon that and said, can we talk about communism after Stalinism without talking about communism? And this is why then I wrote Yesterday's Tomorrow 3 years later, and I went into that. But it was also inspired by this conference, because on this conference there was Katja Diefenbach speaking, a philosopher, Marxist philosopher from Berlin, and in her talk she started mentioning a lot of names, and somebody from the audience shouted, you know, give us more name dropping. And she said, okay, you want more name dropping? I give you more name dropping. And then she mentioned all these names. She said Manny Sperber, Susanne Leonard, Franz Jung, and so on and so on. She went on, because those names were not just name droppings. It was not showing off her knowledge, but these names were the names of communists, libertarian communists who were anti-Stalinist and have been forgotten, not only by the mainstream history, but also by communists themselves. So it was important to bring in these marginalized voices, these marginalized names, these minoritarian revolutionaries back into the discussion. And of course, I think I agree completely with what you say, Michael, that it was possible to write this book, I would say, after 1990, in a way that would not have been possible before that, right? And of course, there are many people who write these kind of books, and these are just the books that I'm also trying to bring back into the memory and are in the back of my book, you know. Let's say, for example, Susanne Leonard, who writes this amazing book, The Stolen Life, where she writes exactly about this, about her biography, where she goes to the Soviet Union and is, as an anti-fascist, as a communist, as a socialist, and is imprisoned and brought to the Gulag. And she publishes this book in the 1950s, and in the foreword, she reflects upon the question whether she shall publish this book or not, whether the publication of this book will harm the socialist international movement or not. And in the end, she decides to publish it because she says, no, not publishing that, remaining silent about Stalinism, not criticizing this Stalinism, this will actually harm socialism, because it will feed into the lie that Stalinism is in fact socialism. And this, I think, is exactly the moment where anti-communism and Stalinism come together, you know. They are complicit in this because they both agree that there is an identity of Stalinism and socialism. They just have different opinions on it. For the anti-communists, this socialism is negative, for the Stalinists is positive. But both are very eager to make unthinkable, to make unrememberable all those communists and communist movements and fractions that were in fact anti-Stalinist, libertarian. And one of the goals of Yesterday's Tomorrow is just in fact to bring back these voices, bring back these minoritarian, libertarian, anti-authoritarian communists in the discussion, and open up history from this perspective. And of course, it was easier after 1990. But as I said already, I think in 1998, when the Black Book of Communism was published, there were also some communists who said, Zvi Schrippkopf, for example, he was said, we should, as communists, not fight against the book, but take it as a beginning and go beyond that and present a more vivid analysis, a more radical, more fundamental, and Marxist analysis of Stalinism than this book is capable of. But even though in part of we can use it, and but it was Yesterday's Tomorrow was written in 2007, so this is before the idea of communism. And just one last thing, that my friend Daniel Loik, the philosopher who also a part in organizing the Indeterminate Kommunismus conference, he was in the US at the time very often, and he said, Bini, we have to publish Yesterday's Tomorrow in English, because it's just a perspective that is missing in the discussion, where you often find yourself in you're either like anti-Stalinist and then anti-communist, like anarchist, or you're somehow in the Leninist faction, which is basically this idea of communist.
Can I reframe just a little? I mean, in essence, the only way, by not remembering Stalinism, you have to forget all of these comrades who died under it. They have to be banished from history, and that's what our obligation is. And the notion also of them being libertarian communists, I think, and the other thing you said, by the way, very well, is that the liberal anti-communists don't remember these people. They're just numbers and names that are swelling the list. So since they're not going to be remembered by the liberals, they have to be remembered by us. But it's not their libertarian dimension, again, which is something liberals can embrace behind. It's the total upside down and topsy-turviness of how one ever gets to a point where one thinks that it's okay to take these people who have been loyal communists and put them in camps, or that if you've got factories that resemble army barracks and are run by Taylorism and involve people working even harder than they do in capitalism, working on weekends, forbidden to strike, that somehow is the dream that people in capitalist society develop to get out of capitalism. Those fundamental things, which are raised by how it's going, one has to get beyond that. It's true, one has to also frame the historical circumstances in ways that liberals don't even do it, not as exculpatory matters, but just simply because we have to get down to the details of what's going on. That, for example, Russia, in Lars Lee's book, says that no regime, whether it's the Tsarist regime or the February regime or so on, ever succeeded after World War I started in getting bread to the population. It was just something that was impossible. It's not a particularly Bolshevik failure. You know, all of these details of history that are absent have to be there, not as an exculpatory pattern, but as part of our attempt to try to understand how we got to this place and how we can never get to it again.
I'm wondering that if Bini, if you can hold on, because it sounded like you had some other things to say, but maybe hold on to them, because then we can join in some other people in the conversation, and then I hope we'll circle back to with things because Stephen, who's here, had a question. I figure you should. Why don't you go, Stephen? And then there are other questions in the chat too, which I'll try to curate and bring in as we can. But Stephen's right here. So why don't you go, Stephen?
Hi, Bini, and everyone. Your book is just amazing. I mean, I really was taken to another planet, and I'm already in another galaxy to begin with. But this, you really did it. It was great. It is great. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, there's so many things, but one of them is about your discussion of counter-revolution. And just backing up a bit, in the argument that the conditions as described by Trotsky and Lenin were right before the revolution in October of 1917 was that for several months, if not a year, Russia was headed into famine, and there was going to be millions of people that were going to die. And so part of the argument that Trotsky put forward was that there was needed to be, we needed to have an economy where people were forced to labor in the manner in which people were forced, conscripted and forced to work in the military. So if we left Tsarism where it was going to be a catastrophe. With the revolution succeeding, then there was a counter-revolution, and with the imperialists fighting and attacking under the conditions where there's famine on the horizon. But then you talk about, well, we have to be prepared for not only that counter-revolution, but for the counter-revolution, which is kind of what led into Stalinism, I gather. And I'd like you to talk about how you think we could even succeed going forward. I don't know if succeed is the right word, but how we could even move forward, given that we're confronted with these enormous obstacles that you outline in your book. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you for that question. I mean, I continued the work on this part of the history later on in other books, and in those I worked more extensively with the concept borrowed from Enzo Traverso, who distinguishes between two binaries or two dichotomies. On the one hand, you have like victory and defeat, and on the other you have success and failure. And I call this the revolutionary dilemmata, because very often, like those pairs are linked to in an anti-parallel manner. And the starting point for the Bolsheviks is like I would say three major historical events. It's like the Paris Commune, the defeat of the Paris Commune, the bloodbath done by the counter-revolution, by the bourgeois counter-revolution. Then it's the Russian Revolution 1905, which is a very similar experience, you know, of a military defeat. And then it's 1914, the betrayal of the social democracy, betrayal of the international solidarity by the social democratic movement. And these three events heighten this authoritarian idea in the Bolsheviks that you must not leave the party politics too open to democratic currents and so on, because you could always have like reformists, you could have like party factions that go in the wrong direction. But for them, it's also very clear, never again shall we experience this kind of defeat. And this is why we have to calculate with counter-revolution, and we have to prepare ourselves for counter-revolution. We will not be defeated by counter-revolution. And in order to like succeed against counter-revolution, we have to become more effective, more militarized, more centralized. And the effect is that indeed they win. They are not defeated, but at the same time, they become so militarized, so centralized, that in a way they lose what they have fought for. So they are victorious, but they fail measured against their own ideals. And this, of course, is the dilemma, because you can see other political socialist groups who were very anti-authoritarian, but then not victorious, but were defeated. So the question is, and I posed this question only in Yesterday's Tomorrow, try to answer it in later books, is like, how can we maneuver through this dilemma?
Well, it's interesting that you end your book with Salvador Allende, who would be an example of the defeat without the failure. So I'll just stop there for a moment in the interest of having more discussion, because obviously I have more to say about this. But no, there is one interesting point you make very well, where you said that people can't project themselves outside of history to see the results and predict them in a certain way. And you do this after listing all the things that are obvious to us as we look back, but that could not have been to anybody in the middle of this. And one thing one can say about Allende is he tried to project himself outside of history, and what he saw would happen if you went outside the system was the Spanish Civil War. He saw essentially 3 years of bloody conflict, and he didn't want that to happen, so he essentially didn't organize. Now, but of course, his particular projection outside of history was entirely hypothetical. It just as easily could have been, had some kind of resistance been mounted, the first coup against Chavez, which was successful for about an afternoon, with the same personnel behind it, a kind of fake democracy movement aligned with some people in the military, but that was overthrown later by a kind of stiff resistance approach, Chavez elements in the, ignoring for a second what happened after that for the next 10 or 12 years. So I'm just saying that, as you rightly say when you discuss it, these are questions of art, feeling for the current moment. They're not things of a science, particularly one that looks outside of history and looks back and said, this is objectively what should be done at this moment, And I guess the argument that this raises is that's why you need a very, very good party that is thinking very well, as opposed to just imposing unthought on a lot of people and measuring loyalty. So when we say the failure of the party, it's not just a libertarian failure as the way it's presented. The party has ceased to be an effective instrument to really measure reality and think about it, And I know people would say, look, Stalin defeated Hitler and so forth. But anybody who knows the story of the first 10 days of Stalin drunk and having killed all the, in 1937, General Tukhachevsky and people in the purge are liable to ascribe the victory to the courage of the Russian people or something nebulous like that, rather than, but we need a party that thinks and thinks well. And one has to have a variety of ideas within it for that to happen.
I think it might be that Bruno next has a point, and then I do have some saved up that are from the chat that eventually we can get to.
Thanks. Yeah. So thanks for this reading, Bini, which unfortunately before this morning, I didn't know your books. This was amazing. My question is about this militarized authoritarian Bolshevik victors that you mentioned, the failure in their victory. So I wonder how can we account for that without absolutizing it, without making it into how it's always accounted for, that the Bolsheviks won because the communist idea will somehow necessarily always turn totalitarian. Like, how do you counter that in your work?
Well, first of all, like in Yesterday's Tomorrow, as Michael mentioned already, I'm working backwards. This book starts in 1939 and then goes backwards to 1917. And as Philip said, it's an ideas and methodology that I took from Walter Benjamin. And with using this methodology, I can say that Marx, who claimed to be not a Marxist, was less influential to Stalin than Stalin was influential to Marx. Marx influenced our notion, our idea of Marx, stronger than Marx influenced Stalin. So the history is at no point like determined, but there is always a moment of contingency in it. But we have to look like much closer to identify these moments and to ask the question: where did it go wrong? How could it have how could have gone in a different direction, and which political decisions would have needed to be made? And if you dive into the history of 1921, 1920, 1919, 18, and 17, you can identify these moments and always ask: is this politics, is this authoritarian move necessary to defeat counter-revolution, or is it more? Or even if is it maybe doing the opposite of what it claims to do? Maybe this authoritarian politics also produces, in a way, a counter-revolutionary movement. Of course, not from the side of the monarchists and the bourgeoisie and the imperialists, but of former allies like social democrats who then joined, for example, the counter-revolution. But one of the reasons why I think that the year 1921 is so very crucial for the understanding of the Russian Revolution, or why I would say this is actually the year when the revolution ends, is that it is at the same time the moment when the Bolsheviks or the socialists win over counter-revolution. And so, like the communists like Victor Serge expect that now the dictatorship would loosen up and council democracy would be reintroduced. When in fact 1921 is also the year where the Kronstadt rebellion is crushed, the last anarchist allies are killed or imprisoned, and even in the Bolshevik party, Lenin decides we have enough now of an internal opposition. We want to get rid of the internal opposition altogether, which is like the workers' opposition, for example, led by Alexandra Kollontai. So you see, 1921 is at the same time the year of victory and failure. And this proves that they are not linked to each other necessarily, but there is a gap, and it's a gap we can use.
I wanted to go to there's several questions on the chat, and there are two I wanted to link together, which maybe aren't questions for Bini if you don't feel, because they're both questions about China and Maoism, and I would even put it in a slightly more general frame, because your thinking here, Bini, is very Soviet centric, and so some of these questions are, one could do a similar question about the history of the Cuban Revolution, so these two questions are about China and Maoism. So one is, here it goes, from someone starting with knowing next to nothing about the history of Maoism in relation to China's state and economy. I'm wondering about what folks think about the lesson of this remembering and the history/future-oriented project in the current moment of what seems like an increased interest in a Cold War with China. another question also about China, and that's why I wanted to put them together. I hope I'm not distorting the two of them. This is William McKeithen. I'm thinking about Michael's question about the historical conditions at the end of the post-Cold War era. As far as formal institutions, so this is the part about how in universities, the question about area studies actually enters into this. So here's the question then after this. Knowing, okay. This is again, sorry, I'm actually repeating it. It's the same one. So the question here then is about what, let me repeat his question and then I could just maybe, anyway, I shouldn't add it a bit. What would this lesson look like with respect to China, especially since in the US now, in some ways, the US competition with China and anti-communism seems to function more along that axis today. I don't know, Bini, do you have anything to say that would, about either about China itself, but if you don't, about the question of linking this history to the Soviet experience exclusively, or what are your thoughts about that? I hope I'm not muddying the water in this.
I mean, I would really also be happy if someone else had any thoughts on that, especially like the last part, how like something that as the Cold Wars feels to be returning now in the confrontation between the US and China. And then maybe I can dive into the discussion at a later point because I also need to get some water.
I do want to mention that we are having a panel, I'm not sure the exact date, check the Red May calendar, on reflecting about the Chinese Cultural Revolution with Alexandra Russo, who wrote a wonderful book about it from Duke University Press, and Assad Haider and Andrea Pizzi.
Rebecca Carl.
Rebecca's not on that one. Rebecca's on another one.
I'm sorry.
We have Andrea Piazzarola Longobardi, who wrote about the Shanghai Workers' Commune, and also Chris Connery. So it should be great. Check it out on the schedule.
But I guess my thinking was in asking this with, I mean, not really asking it to Bini, but maybe asking it to the rest of us, is if this would be, is if one would need, if one were to accept the operation that Bini's proposing, if one would have to go through each of these, like, are we just as much, we, and I'm not sure who the we is here, just as much the inheritors of the Chinese communist experience as we are of the Soviet, and of the Cuban communist experience as much as the Soviet. I mean, and each of them, I mean, would have comparable or roughly similar experiences, or is there something about the privileging of the Soviet experience that is separate? Maybe that's what I'm thinking with regard to. This could also be a difference by, standing in Berlin, it might look one way, and standing in the United States, it might look another. That might be another way of posing this. If there were,
I have a sort of answer to that. I mean, it's not an answer, but a direction that might be interesting. The famous statement that in terms of race, it's not, the problem isn't blackness, but whiteness. And I think anti-communism is the problem in terms of American thinking for a long time. It's so fundamental, not just to the traditional right, but essentially to liberals who are supposed to stand for the Enlightenment, and yet whose relation to Marx or the Soviet Union or any other thing is comparable to the right's relation to Darwin. They haven't read Darwin, but they got it from their pastor. liberals haven't sort of read Marx's Capital, but they've read Isaiah Berlin or something. So they know there's nothing there. Because anti-communism is so scattershot, aimed essentially at everything, left and right, from Cuban to Chinese to Soviet, I think there is a virtue for focusing in on some specific experience, like the Soviet, like Bini does, and sort of taking us through that particular moment. So.
Sorry that I was muted. That happens all the time these days. Here's another question. This is one really directed at Bini. Red May just had an event on Lukács and history and class consciousness. The figure of Stalin was missing from this, as well as the subject of the party. You ascribe to Lukács a kind of epistemology of vigilance. What do you mean by this? And can you talk about its historical and social expression? Okay, Bini, I'm not sure that I can represent the question adequately. Does it work for you, or should I go back to the question, see if we can?
An ontology of vigilance.
An epistemology of vigilance is what. But maybe the point, and this seems to me to speak directly to you, Bini, is about Lukács. You know, that in working through Lukács, for instance, his history and class consciousness, does one have to, in reading that, you know, in such an event, for instance, the other day at Red May on Lukács discussing history and class consciousness, is it required or productive, there we go, there to talk about the party and Stalin in relation to such discussions? You know, in some ways I can imagine someone saying, look, we're doing a theoretical discussion now, we're working his theoretical book. We don't need to put it either with him or with Althusser, you know, like their relationship to the party isn't what is in question here. We want to look at their theory. I have the sense that you think somewhat differently about that.
Yeah, because I mean, in a way, for me, it's amazing when you hear this kind of thinking from theorists who are part of a Marxist or materialist tradition, because it strikes me as a more idealist view on theory and the relation of theory to history. Like the materialist perspective, which also I take from theorists like Marx, teaches us, I think, something else, that theory and history, personality, psychology, and so on, economy are intertwined. And I would, of course, always say not in a reductionist way. So there's never at no point a determination, but it is always worth to dig deeper and to think through these connections. Even if you take like an author like Alexandra Kollontai, you know, who was anti-Leninist, but later remained silent about Stalinism. And then the question of, even with Alexandra Kollontai, the question occurs, how could she be like a diplomat for the Stalinist bureaucracy after everything she'd done and written, and after knowing that all her comrades from the workers' opposition had basically been killed by this very regime. And with Lukács, I mean, Lukács appears in Yesterday's Tomorrow in this meeting of German writers, and he's not a writer in this sense. He's the philosopher in the room, but this is like this perch where they sit together, and they have to declare their failures and have to declare where they were not obeying the party line. And in this, you can really see that Lukács is acting in a classical Stalinist way, and you can also see this in some of its theoretical works, right? Very clearly in his opposition to Kronstadt.
I think I'm not representing the questioner, and the questioner might have to excuse me for this, but I just want to clarify something the way you're saying it, because it seems to me that you're saying, like reading Lukács this way, that it's not like recognizing his Stalinist behavior in this meeting means that we can take nothing good from history and class consciousness, or that we shouldn't read Lukács or something like that. And the only reason I'm saying it, because this is, I think, your attitude in the entire book, which is we can have the strength to recognize these things without them disqualifying what's the tradition and the parts involved. But I think the reason it's important to bring up or to clarify or to insist on it, because I think I can think of all kinds of homologous or analogous relations that it's not uncommon to say, for instance, we should get out of the Marxist tradition with this. I was going to say, like since, that something in, I don't know, Nietzsche's a misogynist, for instance, which of course, like super is, no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean you can't read Nietzsche. That shouldn't disqualify us from even reading Nietzsche for feminist purposes. And so I was thinking in the same way that you're recognizing these material conditions and political positions, you're not intending to, I guess I'm trying to clarify that with you. You're not intending to say, therefore, we need to read everything that person wrote through the lens of, I don't know, their Stalinist activity or something like that. It helped me. I'm not quite saying it right, but I'm just trying to avoid a misunderstanding of the way you're approaching it. That's what I'm trying to do.
No, I mean, what I'm saying is that we have to get rid of this illusion of innocence, in either way. We cannot find an innocent Marx, and a Marx that is like innocent, has nothing to do, is completely irresponsible for what happened afterwards. That doesn't mean we have to get rid of Marx. This would be this illusion of innocence. Find somebody else who is like completely holy, who we can pray upon or something. No, we have to think through. I think one theorist who does it wonderfully is Susan Buckmore in the book Hegel in Haiti, where she says it is actually, let's say, a theory, the hypothesis, it's this division of labor also in the sciences and the humanities that causes these distinctions. There are some historians who work on the racism of Kant and Hegel, and there's philosophers who work on the theory. And since there's this division in labor in the studies in the sciences, they don't come together. And there's also like no desire or affect or emotions in bringing that together. And then she says how strange it is for her when there's this one scholar who says, yeah, but then also this is plainly racist what Hegel says, and it's not just zeitgeist, it's also outraging, So, but does it mean that you cannot work with Hegel? It would be crazy, but it means that you have to work in a certain way with it, be responsible, working through it.
So, I mean, I think you have a dialogue from Manish Sperber in the book during the purge trials, the interrogation, which really demonstrates how incapacitated this unexamined sense of innocence leaves a person before the kind of before interrogation. And it's when someone says, I'm going to testify in the trials against Comrade Stalin of all the bad things he's done. I'm not going to say what you want me to say. I'm going to go against this whole proceedings. And the interrogator says things like, well, did you feel that we were wrong at Kronstadt? Or did you feel we were wrong? And it goes through everything for the last 10 years. And the guy says, yes, I do. I think we're wrong track. And the interrogator says, but you said nothing. So after establishing about 10 years of having said nothing, the interrogator then says, so you say nothing, but at the moment your own life is threatened. You're the person who needs to sacrifice himself to maintain the party. You speak up. What is that worth, and so forth. And it's almost a devastating argument. How do you come back to that? You know, and so you can almost say that in order not to have to answer that particular thing, it's important to speak out at every moment. So.
Yeah, exactly. I think that it is important to work through this, and I think it's not an historical question, you know? And it's not a specific question of the Soviet Union. You cannot get rid of it and say, okay, this is a very specific historical circumstances. I think that the history of the Soviet Union poses a more principled question. And if you think through Stalinism, if you think through the logic of Stalinism, and that is also what is interesting when confronting Lukács, you realize it's not just stupid, you know, it's not just dumb, it's not only reactionary, but there is some truth to it. You know? There's some argument to that you will find tempting, right? When the Stalin says, what good is it if you are on the right side? If you are morally right, if you don't have the power to make it right, what good does it do? It's a very strong argument. And of course, like Leninism and Stalinism, they follow this logic to a point where it turns completely around. But it makes sense to think through it. And I wanted to add something to the discussion earlier, because one possible outcome of this debate could be, or one possible reading of this could be, that now, like for example, yesterday's tomorrow, or I propose an argument that goes like, anti-communists are not able to understand the terror of communism. Only communists are able to understand the terror of Stalinism, which then means that I propose some kind of like communist identity politics, you know, which would say, the history of communism is our history, and we are the only ones who could deal with it. And I would strongly recommend not to go in this identitarian direction, but to keep a little bit distance of it. I think that everybody who is really convinced that we need to change the social structure of present times, social structure of, as you mentioned, Michael, patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, and really wants to build a different society, for everybody who really wants to change the world, this history of people who also wanted to change the world, but had a different outcome than they wanted it originally, is like a very important lesson, you know, whether they identify as communists or not. It's not a question of identity, of identifying, but this is a real historical and more than historical questions that are posed by this history. You know? How can you overcome domination without producing domination yourself?
I would say we have two. I think maybe we should do at the same time 2 questions on our live feed. In fact, why don't Sean, you go second, and you know, I don't know who the name behind Fabs the Rocket is, but let's just go Fabs the Rocket. Why don't you go first?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Hello.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Bini, thank you so much. Your book sounds as wonderful in English as it does in German. Yeah, I have a question regarding, because the book is about failure and about how the left has failed to deal with that failure in any manner, actually. And also, and now, so for me, the question is, as I'm working a lot with homeless people and organizing a lot with homeless people, and now we have to form a support group because homeless people get discriminated by leftists, is the ever reoccurring fact that although people, especially from the radical left, should know that they very probably are very broken, because that is what capitalism does. English. So my question would be, can you imagine an actual culture of of embracing, I guess, a more like an idea of discovery, I guess, so that being wrong, also on a very personal level, like in your own activist group, in your own writing or whatever, that failure, actually becomes the necessity that it is right now in this society and with power relations as they are. Yeah, is that even a question?
I think, yeah, Bini, can you hold on to that for a second? And we have Sean's question, even if they're separate. I think it's good to have, more voices in the discussion. I'm holding on to your question too, in case I don't want it to get lost. Go ahead, Sean.
Howdy, all. Again, Bini, thank you so much for doing this. It's been just such a pleasure to listen in and be a part of this and have you with us. I am notoriously long-winded and tangential, so I wrote this down to keep it short. So just bear with me real quick. So in the chapter titled Revolution, you talk about the figure of Lenin, but as Lenin the undead, neither present nor absent, neither dead nor living, neither body nor spirit. We meet Lenin as Lenin, Lenin as corpse, Lenin as geolocation, Lenin as spectacle, and ultimately Lenin the betrayer of Kronstadt. And so this part of the book seemed pretty important to me in our contemporary contexts, where we're seeing sort of like Lenin's great revival and in movement use and in organizational purposes. So my question is, what do you think we should do with Lenin today? And do you think his contemporary rebirth is the Lenin of the revolution or the Lenin of the mausoleum? So, thank you.
Bini, I'm not asking you to do these two together. I don't think you can put them together, but.
Well, having said that, that we have to think through the interconnectedness of theory, politics, economy, history, and so on. I would also find it hard to find this one way of dealing with Lenin, like this one perspective or this one sentence, or the one truth to finish it up. But in fact, if we dive in the history of the Russian Revolution, I think it is a bit weird why it is exactly Lenin who gets so much attention. It's not completely weird. There's reason to it, but I think it is worthy to remember different communist activists even more. In a way, I think it's like also we're going into the very bourgeois trap of remembering or imagining history as a history of these great men and their decisive decisions that they make, their courage and so on. Even if you look precisely at the history of the Bolshevik Party, only the Bolshevik Party, as the historian Alexander Rabinovich does greatly in his book, The First Year, where he focuses only on the first year, you can see that even in the Bolshevik Party, there's like many different factions. That there's Bolsheviks who are open to forming alliances with the Social Democrats, the Social Revolutionaries, anarchists, the Mensheviks, and so on. And you can see, I think, very precisely that in the first year, almost every decision that was made by Lenin against the majority of the party, usually against the majority of the party, was wrong. And starting with the October, the putsch, the march at the Winter Palais, where most of the members in the Bolshevik Party were against it, were advising against it, were overruled. So it would be, I think, even more interesting. Even though I look at the revolution not as a revolution of a party, but of course as the revolution of a multitude or an ensemble of micro-revolutions, as I call it, I think it is more interesting to look at the Bolshevik Party than it would be interesting to look at Lenin. I think because I think there are some traditions in there that can also be more useful to the present time. And here I will try to build this connection to your question, Fabs. Because of course we can see that there is this very particular Leninist tradition, which is exactly unable to admit to failure and to weakness and to ambiguity and ambivalence and so on. And there's other traditions who are more open to these tones than it is Lenin. You know? If you just only look at the words that Lenin and Trotsky use the most, and it is, for example, a word like "without compromise." This idea that a radical politics has to be without compromise is something very vivid in them. And there's other traditions who can give us a different approach. But I'm also hesitant to take like lessons from history and place them just in a different historical setting, because I'm also thinking this is not just about, you know, habitus, about like a Haltung, about the way you position yourself. It's like, you know, 5 steps to be a bit better communist. But it's of course the historical conditions that allow us, that enable us, or make it difficult to go in a different direction. And if you find yourself in a situation of strong opposition, in a binary situation, it gets very, very complicated to move out of it. It's just what Micah said, is like during the Cold War, it is much more difficult to write a book that is like somehow beyond this dichotomy than afterwards. But one last sentence to the question of Lenin. There is, and it also goes back to the beginning of our talk, there's this very interesting remark of Eva von Redeker, philosopher Eva von Redeker, who says that often she finds that those Leninists, those philosophers today, going back to Lenin, that they mistake that which provokes the bourgeoisie the most, with that which is most radical. If you side with Lenin, if you quote Lenin, this seems to be very radical because it provokes you know your enemy very, very much. But this does not mean that this position is the most radical. And this is also connected to the question of like our notion of communism, the topic of you, Michael, that I would like to come back to. I think it is important to go beyond this determined negation, you know, bestimmte Negation, which thinks that communism is just the opposite of capitalism. It's just the opposite of domination. It is not. It's neither the job of communists to create a world that is completely new, that has no connections to the old world. You know, that would be a fetish. Nor is it the job to create a world, a communism, that is like the exact opposite, the exact negation of capitalism. That would be, in a way, still too related to this domination. But communism is communism when it is exactly like a communal society in which everybody is equal in the regard in this, that they can freely create the world they are living in. You know, so it is a positive goal. It's not a negative goal. It's not about overcoming this domination. It's about creating solidary relations.
Bini, I just want to refer to a quote that you have somewhere in the book where you say, essentially, Leninism is a creation of Stalin. And I think it's important to remember that because one can find many examples of a flexible Lenin as one goes along, even though he's come to stand for inflexibility and absolutely the most radical position. And there's a famous quote about someone saying to him in 1906, wait, you're telling us to take positions in the assembly now, and last year you said we shouldn't, that would be reformism. He said, last year we were powerful, now we're not. Or, you know, that famous line, which I wish I could remember exactly, which is, we had no plan, we just made it up as we went along. You know, against that whole Richard Pipes school of history, which says the Bolsheviks came in with this plan for installing a top-down command government. So, you know, I also want to sort of go against what I said earlier. The focus on these events and so forth is that I think a kind of ragtag approach to the Soviet Union and the Second World, where one finds little elements that float to the surface that you find very interesting. It didn't necessarily take shape because of the plan of the central government or the party, but just simply happened because capitalism wasn't operating in a particular area. The fact, for example, that the Soviet Union produced so many great mathematicians. I mean, what they say is that Stalin was the chief scientist in biology, but he didn't understand mathematics. So he just gave these guys blackboards in an institute and chalk, and they sat there for 30 years, absent from all the pressures that administrations in capitalist education put on all departments now. And by the time they sort of left the Soviet Union, they were doing such great stuff that Western departments snatched them up right away. I just mentioned that as not to mitigate what we were talking about, but to try to encourage many approaches to the second world, that there's still a lot to be interested in and look at, you know, but we certainly have to make what you bring up the central point to our own development of communism.
I just wanted to link back to something that Fab Sarak had said before and then I think we're probably going to try to think about tying things up, you know, because we're getting near the time. But it occurs to me that, you know, because when you, Fab Sarak, we're talking about the failures and the, in some ways, history of failures, and I think that many, reading Bini's work, one could focus on that. On the failures, I'm just wondering, I realize that I myself am translating every time we say failures or even crimes and something like that, I'm translating myself into defeat. So not thinking of failure, but as defeat. And it means something different to me. And I'm just wondering if I'm putting my own slant on it that doesn't fit in this, because with a defeat, it seems to me it's in some ways there's continuity to the struggle. There's continuity to the struggle because it was, you know, it was their own limitations that had them defeated, or even the circumstances around them. You know, I'm not interested, for instance, in a moral condemnation of Lenin or even of Stalin. It's, you know, if I had been in that situation, would I have done differently? You know, that sort of thing. It's more that is that the project was defeated, and that we. Yeah, I'm very tied to this idea that the struggle, you know, that people conduct this struggle, that it doesn't come out the way they thought, that it may be even differently than what we wanted, and we pick up the struggle and take it in a different direction, so that we have to keep struggling under this banner. I think Bini talks sometime about picking up the red flags from the mud or something like that, rather than thinking that we have to either exorcise or cut from our history all of these bad elements or bad decisions. I think for me, if I translate it into, I find myself translating into questions about defeat, and that seems a quite different relationship to that history. I mean, maybe even start closer to home. I mean, it was very important for many people, and me included, after Occupy Wall Street, to recognize that it's not that Occupy Wall Street failed, it was defeated. It could have been defeated for all kinds of its own reasons too. It doesn't mean that everyone did everything right or something like that. but it's not because it was a failed idea. It was because, partly for military response to the police and other things defeated it. The Paris Commune was defeated too. It wasn't that it failed. I would say that the Soviet experience too was a defeat rather than it failed. Bini's not on board with that one. But anyway, I was just trying it out. I was just trying it out, wondering what it changes. That's okay. I'm speaking a little hypothetically. And I think I had Bini going for a little while, and then she realized she wasn't with me.
No, I mean, as I said, I find very helpful this distinction between defeat and failure that I take from Enzo Traverso. And in this, defeat is something that is brought to you like from the outside, like that's from the counter-revolution, from the White Army. And so I agree, the Paris Commune is defeated, and Occupy Wall Street is defeated, of course, very, very differently, but yes. But the Soviet Union was not defeated. And this is also what makes it so special. It is the first socialist revolution that is not defeated, but it is able to defend itself against imperialism, against counter-revolution. Of course, you can bring back the question whether the outer conditions, the imperialist struggle or war, and on a military and an economical perspective, fed into this development and were maybe like finally responsible for the defeat in 1989. Yes, I would say 1989, 1990, the Soviet Union collapses, but it is also defeated. But prior to this defeat is a failure. And this is what I said earlier about 1921. In 1921, the Bolsheviks, the socialists, are victorious. They have won over the counter-revolution, and they could have more communism, as you said earlier. It would have been possible at this time in history, even before, to have a more communist society, which would also be more advertising for communism than that which followed after. And that this communist, like solidary, libertarian, egalitarian communism did not happen. This is not like mainly the responsible of counter-revolution, mainly the responsibility or only the responsibility of imperialism, but also of communists. This is why here I talk about failure, and so it's a different approach and raises different kind of questions.
So I think we're about to wrap up here, even though we have more questions. I do want to take Bruno's comment because Bruno has studied the fiction of Antoine Volodine and has a very interesting comment on the defeat of the Soviet experience from jailed revolutionaries who took up writing in prison. It'd be fun to leave. Bruno, can you translate that from French?
Sure. Yeah. They ruminated on the promises that hadn't been accomplished, and they as writers, they invented worlds where the defeat was just as systematic and bitter as in what you call the real world. And just briefly, what's always interested me is that it takes account of the tragedy of communism, at least in the Soviet Union, without repudiating communist desires, it seems to me, although it does it by making it into a tragedy. And so I'm not sure there's much future involved. So anyway, thank you for letting me slip that in there.
All right. Well, thanks.
Reading.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks very much, Bini, for beaming yourself from Germany to take part in this discussion. I do want to say, and thank you for Michael for being such a channeler of currents and questions to keep the discussion going very well. I do want to mention again that on Sunday, May 30th, 11 a.m., Rethinking the Chinese Revolution with Alessandro Russo, Andrea Piazzolla Longobardi, and Chris Connery, and Asad Haider. So that certainly will continue the line revolutionary reflection that Bini has inaugurated for us here. And also to remind everybody that on Thursday and Friday, we have the following events at 11 a.m. tomorrow: Real Abstraction in the Mind, but Not From There. Check on the schedule, www.redmaycl.org, for the blurb and who's on it. At 4 p.m., Red Nation Rising: From Border Town Violence to Native Liberation, Neighborhood Liberation. We need that too, but it's not going to be discussed. Friday at 11 a.m., Survival and Resistance, Mutual Aid in Disastrous Times. And at 3 p.m., What We Talk About When We Talk About Marx. If you like the discussions we do and want Red May to continue for another 5, 20, 25 years, give to Red May. There are two options. One is our GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May. The other is on our website. Donate, under the donate button, you can do a Patreon for us. So thank you very much, everybody, for participating in this discussion, and enjoy the rest of the day.